Not really sure what happened, and it still freaks me out to this day. My daughter was 4 years old at the time and developed pneumonia. Her breathing would stop in her sleep, so we took her to the ER. She was there for a total of 5 days. For the first 3 days, her health kept deteriorating, and on the third day, my girlfriend got a call that her mother had collapsed and was taken to the hospital. She was without oxygen for 20 minutes and was declared officially brain dead. That same night, my daughter woke up and asked about grandmother. No one had said anything to her or in the room with her. We asked her what did she mean, and she told us that grandma came to her in a dream and said it's not your time yet. I'll go for you. Immediately, the next day, she was almost 100% better. My girlfriend is anaphylactic and is triggered by a chemical called salicylate, and it's found in pretty much every food. When she was in high school, she had her first big reaction, and the school nurses refused to administer her EpiPen, which is just an adrenaline shot, until the ambulance had gotten there. Now, obviously, having an anaphylactic reaction doesn't give you a lot of waiting time, so by the time the ambulance got to her school, she was in pretty bad shape and barely conscious. The paramedics immediately administered one of her EpiPens, called the nurses twats, and loaded her into the ambulance as her mom arrived. She continued to fade, so they gave her a direct injection of adrenaline this time. Still nothing. They give her a second direct injection of adrenaline, and this time it hits her about 30 seconds later all at once, and her heart fails. She stops breathing. No pulse, nothing. Dead to the world. For about 2 minutes and 46 seconds, she was clinically dead. And the scariest thing is, she saw nothing. She tells me that when you are losing consciousness, you can't tell the difference between waves of drowsiness and when your body actually shuts down. All she saw was the darkness of her eyelids, and it felt like going into an extremely calm sleep where she couldn't hear or feel anything, and she didn't mind it apparently. All despite the fact her mother and the paramedics were screaming at her to keep her eyes open, and the ambulance was flying towards the hospital. She miraculously just came back to life almost 3 minutes later, and as they were giving her chest compressions, and the cardiologist that assessed her later stated that all the adrenaline in her body was enough to not only stop her heart, but to also restart it with a little help from the paramedic pumping it around. To this day, she still can't differentiate falling asleep after a long day and dying. I was on loads of morphine, so it's still really hazy, and the fact it happened almost 6 years ago doesn't help the memory. But I'll try to recollect as accurately as I can. What happened and what I experienced. I had appendicitis, and my foster parents at the time didn't take me to the hospital until almost 3 days after it had burst. I should have been dead well before they took me. Even the doctors called it a miracle. Well, I died while waiting for surgery. I had to wait for a pediatric surgeon to come in because no one else felt comfortable performing the surgery on a case this bad with a child this size. So, while I was waiting for the surgeon, I was in a room with me, the doctor, my 2 foster parents, and my grandmother, who is an RN. Like I said, I was really drugged up and I couldn't really focus on much, and I couldn't really do anything. The monitor I was hooked up to would beep really loudly from time to time, and the intervals between beeps started to decrease rapidly. Turns out I wasn't breathing. I was conscious for the most part. I just kept forgetting to breathe. Doctors had to keep nudging me so I wouldn't sleep. I just remember being pissed at this loud beeping that kept me from enjoying a nice slumber. The doctor had to step out for a second, and my grandmother assured me that she could look after me for just a second. Unfortunately for her, she was out of her mind with rage at my foster parents. She didn't hold anything back. My grandmother is sweet. She's a Mormon and without a rude bone in her body. Well, I heard quite a few fuck yous, pieces of shit, etc. My point is that she didn't even notice I had passed out until the monitor signaled I had flatlined. This is the bit where I died and is by far the most vivid part of my experience. I remember being capable of thought, but no thoughts were in my head. I can only describe it as being conscious of my spirit, but without a body for my thoughts to be processed in. I just kind of existed without feeling, thinking, or being anything. I was floating. Honestly, at the time, it was a great feeling. I don't remember any visions of people, family, places, or anything like that. But I felt something wrap around me and comfort me. Without talking, I was assured I was okay, that there was nothing to be worried about, and that point my thoughts returned. I knew at that moment, without knowing how long I'd be able to keep thinking, that I had to go back. I didn't want to, but knowing that last thing I'd see before I left mortal life was these two pieces of human trash who had abused me, neglected me, and treated me like a stain that they didn't want to bother trying to clean up, that did it. I wanted to get back to my body, fix my life so I can go back and live with my biological parents and feel loved again. In that moment, that's all I cared about. And then I sort of willed myself back. Doctors had tried to resuscitate me, but had failed. Everyone was shocked when I opened my eyes and seeing the tears in my grandmother's eyes after thinking she'd lost me. That did it. I'd fixed my life. I reinvented myself and threw out all of my anger, depression, rage, and everything else that put me in Brent and Karen's home. I was electrocuted by about 13,800 volts. The doctors say it's likely the first hit had stopped my heart, and the second one started it before I was pulled like a lifeless corpse to safety. I remember experiencing the darkest dark and the most silent of silence. I ceased to care that I was dying. Time itself seemed to change. It could have been hours, it seemed, but it was only about 30 seconds. I felt as though I was floating and floated towards something that I eventually realized was my body and reality. Upon joining with whatever it was I was floating towards, I became self-aware in my body and heard the electricity making horrible noises and knew I was in danger. From there, it was a horribly painful experience where I lost most of my toes due to tissue death and had severe electrical burns on all 4 limbs. More surgeries than I care to count, and seeing the round bone ends of my toes that were freshly amputated still haunts me a little. I was dead for a very short period of time, like 30 seconds to a minute. See, there's a big misconception about it. It's not like sleeping at all. I'll try to explain. There's always a sort of white noise in the back of my mind. It quiets down when I sleep, but it's still there. I never noticed it before I died, but I do now. I don't want to romanticize death, but when I was out, it was like this perfect nothingness. And nothingness is so hard to imagine normally, but once you experience it, and they bring you back, part of you wishes you could have stayed. There's no positive feelings there, obviously, but it takes away everything bad too. All your stress, the nightmares, the troubles, all gone. Just nothing exists. It's beautiful in a way. I'm not suicidal at all, and hope to live the rest of a long and happy life. But I'm very much looking forward to a lack of consciousness when I do eventually pass again. When I was 15, I was scheduled to do a tilt table test, which is they lean you up to an angle on a table, because I was consistently experiencing dizziness and fainting spells. After about 20 minutes, the doctor tilted the table back, and I could feel myself passing out. I got severe tunnel vision and lost like 95% of my eyesight, like looking through a straw, and then I blacked out. I remember hearing the doctor call the code and my father cussing at the doctor that he killed me. I remember hearing a lot of slamming and banging around, which I assumed was the crash cart and nurses shoving into the small testing room. I felt a pressure on my chest, like when you have someone stand on your back to crack it, which I found out later was the nurses doing CPR. I saw an array of vivid colors kind of dancing around, forming objects in the dark. The scariest thing was how peaceful it felt. Just pure 100% peace. No panic, no pain, no sadness, nothing, just bliss. I coded for just under 2 minutes, and as soon as I came to and opened my eyes, I felt seriously angry and hostile. I started ripping off whatever I could get my hands on and yelling at the doctor to get me off the table. Not me, but right before my great-grandmother passed, she kept trying to explain these vivid colors and smells. She kept saying how beautiful things were, and she was saying it's unlike anything she's ever seen. She was an extremely religious woman. A little while after the colors and smells, she told us that he said he would have to say it's okay for her to go. I mean, my whole family was standing around saying goodbye. I vividly remember this even though I was only 9. Once we all said it was okay, she passed on. Also, the night before, she was talking to herself. We asked her what's going on, and she pointed to the chair across the room and said, "Please don't be rude. I'm having a conversation with her." And we're confused and asked about what, and she said the woman was explaining what we were going to do with our futures. So strange, and I'll never know if it was real or not, or what was happening, but it's cool to think that it was real. I was 6 to 7 years old, and one day I got rushed to the hospital by my parents because they heard me breathing really loud and hard. The last thing I remembered were faces of doctors and nurses above me while I was lying on my back. Then I flatlined. The weirdest, unexplainable thing happened then and there. I suddenly could see the whole scene as a spectator, like I was a floating spirit in that room. I could see myself getting revived, saw my mom crying and my dad comforting her. Then I saw a white entity shaped like my body falling through the ceiling and slowly, like a leaf on the wind, falling down to eventually land inside my body. That's when my experience ended. I was put in a medically induced coma, and I woke up after some days. I don't quite remember. I had stuff plugged into me, an IV, red glowing elastic ring on my finger, etc. Anyway, I later mentioned to the doctors that I saw it all. I saw them using the defibrillators, my parents, etc. No one really believed me and told me that I was probably dreaming or basing my memories due to watching TV, but I know what I saw. I don't share it much, but I've had 4 heart surgeries, and in my first and third one, I coded. You had to be conscious for these surgeries to get your heart to react appropriately. The first time, it was just nothingness. Black. Just nothing. I can't even explain how long it felt like nothingness. And then I remember waking up with them over me, saying, "We lost you for a second. Are you okay?" The second time is the hard one to share. I woke up in a type of subway feeling thing, but everything was white. The subway, the tunnel walls were speeding through. I didn't have a body per se. It felt like I was the subway at times, and at times it was like I was just looking out a window at the tunnel wall. It came to a stop and it was just black nothingness again. And then I heard a voice of a much older man. He told me, "Are you ready to go?" And I just had nothing. Like I didn't know how to speak. "We're going now if you're ready." And something inside me felt so ready to go. Like I was a magnet to it. This unknown destination in the black nothingness ahead. I remember finally just saying, "Okay." He said another time with a slightly different tone, "We'll be leaving here. Are you ready to go?" And finally, something in me snapped, and I remembered I had a life, and people I'd leave behind. And my first thought was, I can't leave my girlfriend. I couldn't do that. And my mom and dad, my puppies, I can't leave any of them. My family, my friends. And I made a decision I couldn't leave. I didn't even have to say it. Once I decided I couldn't leave and I was for sure staying, I woke up and came to consciousness with the medical team all around me. My dad clinically died for over a minute as a result of iodine drip during a procedure, despite a documented severe iodine allergy. He described it as an out-of-body experience in which there was complete silence, and he was the spectator in the upper corner of the room, watching the staff scramble to revive him. He said he had no concept of time or of the panic below. He just observed in total peace. He saw one nurse finally notice his bracelet and alert everybody what the issue was. They cut the IV drip and continued their efforts to revive him. During this time, even though he was watching the end of his life, he felt an extreme peace and was pain-free for the first time in years. He was aware that he was dying, and he was ready and content. Everything got bright, and he started to float upwards, until he saw a man that he did not recognize who told him it wasn't his time yet. All at once, he was jolted back into his body and came to. Once stable, he described what he witnessed and even thanked the particular nurse that noticed his allergy alert bracelet. They were all baffled that he knew such detail. I can only hope that when he did pass away 4 years ago, it was an even more peaceful experience than this. It gives me peace knowing death was something that he had faced already, so he wasn't scared of it when it came for him again. So, this is a second-hand story from my dad, and he's always been a little shaken up when he's told this story. Years before I came along, my dad was cruising around on his motorcycle when a little dog ran straight into the road at him, barking. He swerved so he wouldn't hit the poor pup, and a car in opposing traffic did as well. My dad got clipped as a result and thrown off his bike. It was on a hill, so he slid pretty far until his body hit a parked car. Now, the weird part, he always got this sort of haunted look when he talked about it, which wasn't very often. He says he remembers plain as day standing at the bottom of the street on the corner, watching as a man got hit off his bike and tumbled through the air and down the hill. He says he remembers thinking, that guy is definitely going to die. He woke up the next day in the hospital with a nurse picking gravel out of his back. He had reconstruction surgery on his hand and arm, which consists of mostly metal pins now. Remember, kids, if on a motorcycle, always wear your leather. When I was 18 years old, I had major chest surgery due to an incident I had while being in the Army. I awoke after surgery only to realize I was not actually awake. I woke up to utter darkness. I could hear the voices around me talking about me praying I was going to get better. But the voices got quieter and the darkness diminished. A light had started to appear, and this light was no ordinary hospital light, lamp, the sun, or anything like that. The light was so bright, yet I couldn't look away. I felt it getting closer and closer, and then I heard a voice. It was my mother's. She was talking about me, talking about how I was crying. Then I felt it. The light was right there. If I would have stuck my hand out, I could have touched it. I could feel myself sobbing over what I was seeing, but I was unable to do anything. After a couple of minutes of staring into the light, I finally found the courage to reach out to it. But when I went to grab it, I found myself waking up in my hospital bed with everyone's eyes focused on me. Now, I'm not religious by any means, or so I have considered the option of my dream happening due to anesthetic. But this did not feel like a dream. It felt too real. I still see the darkness to this day. A few years ago, I was on an ATV that malfunctioned, throwing me off about 12 feet directly on my forehead. A family friend said I sailed through the air like a limp noodle. I ended up face down in the street. A few minutes went by and they said I started making gurgling noises from all the blood and then stood up. At this time, the fire department and police were en route. When they approached me, they said I was trying to walk back into my house. One of the firefighters, a stocky guy, probably 240 pounds, put his arms out. I grabbed him around the waist and picked him up about a foot off the ground and just held him there. He said he could tell I wasn't there. He asked me to please put him down, and I did. They then proceeded to tackle me to the ground, where 6 men basically sat on me while they tried to get an IV started. I was then airlifted to the hospital. According to medical records, I was resuscitated multiple times on the helicopter. When we landed, I was placed in a coma for a total of 3 days. I have no memory after the ATV malfunctioned until I was finally awoken. The feeling that best describes what I experienced is hard to describe, but I will do my best. It reminded me of standing on a beach with the only sensory feeling being the sun shining on me. My brain was completely relaxed with absolutely no other inputs. I had this feeling early on. I had no sense of time during this. I was bleeding internally from my brainstem and was given a 25% chance of living. That's not everything is great that is 25% alive, but very bad off. I came out of the sedation to my wife telling me that I had been in an accident. When the first doctor saw me, he was speechless. He said, "I never thought I would be talking to you." I reached out and shook his hand, saying thank you. I know this is a long post and I need to answer the questions asking regarding religion and outlook on life. I would say that prior to this, I was not a very religious person. Now, I'm not super religious, but I do think there was something much larger at work. After this ordeal, I knew my time was limited and that I had put off having kids for too long. A lot changed after my accident. When you deal with something as traumatic as this, you have to push yourself to recover. Within the first year, I started working in a new industry and working out daily. You have to push your body and mind to build those new pathways in your brain. The first 1 to 2 years are the most important. About 13 years ago, I fell into a retention pond in the middle of winter. I was wearing a down coat and, despite being a good swimmer, had a very hard time getting out. In fact, I barely made it out back. I got my upper torso out of the water and fell on the shore. From there until waking up in the ambulance to the EMT saying they didn't have a pulse, I don't remember. I do remember, though, while I was out, what I saw was a bright white mixed with memories of my uncle who had died several years earlier. At this point in my life, I was searching for religion and was a pretty shitty person. After I regained consciousness and yelled, "I'm alive!" I reflected upon my life choices for several weeks. I kept going back to the experience of near death. When I arrived at the hospital that day, my body temp was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It took 5 hours to get my temp up to normal, and the doctors were surprised I was even still alive. Thinking about that and what I saw made me realize that it didn't matter what religion I chose, I needed to be a better person. It took a few years for the self-reflection and inner thoughts to take effect, but I ultimately decided upon a philosophy of living instead of a religion. I chose Daoism as a basis for my philosophy of life. A few years later, around 7 or 8 years ago, I started seeing everything around me as a basis for what others might call God. I attempted suicide by gunshot just over 5 years ago. Was found by a coworker who came back to check on me when I was late and got rushed to the local hospital and then flown via helicopter to a better hospital about a 30-minute drive away. Doctors claimed that I died and was resuscitated 5 times during the commute. Spent about 5 months in and out of hospitals during recovery, and the whole time I had doctors telling me that I shouldn't be alive and that something out there decided that I still have a job to do on this blue marble. Hearing some of the best doctors in the region tell me that over and over again convinced me that there is a higher power out there. I was raised Christian, but I can't bring myself to believe that what they say is completely correct. I believe that there is a power out there that cares about us and what we do, in my opinion. They have a goal and know the one way that we will reach the goal for us, and that they are content to let us do our own thing, with them just nudging us in the right direction, and only really intervening when we mess up. I died at a gig way back in 1991, and it was the best thing that has ever happened to me. It was a very crowded gig, and they had terrible N-shaped barriers of the type which is used to be common on soccer terraces, which, when the crowd surged, caused ripples like eddies in water to go through the crowd. Somebody actually died in a gig in the same venue not long after. For those who are curious, I was seeing the Pixies, again, back in 1991. Anyway, what happened was that in one of the crowd surges, I was swept off my feet and pretty quickly ended up being dragged through the crowd and crushed. I was, understandably, pretty scared by what was going on and was making efforts to try and get to somewhere less crushed. But time and time again, I would be swept up off my feet and dragged through the crowd. After being dragged down to the floor a few times and finding myself on the bottom of a pile of people, things started to get a little strange. The first few times being down had been pretty much as I expected. Being walked over by a crowd would be like panic-inducing and painful. I then reached a stage where I was repeatedly having people fall over me. They would get picked up, and I would get picked up, and as I hadn't had the strength to stand, I would collapse again on the floor, and the whole process would be repeated. I know I was trampled and ended under piles of people, at least 12 times. Then things started to get strange. At one occasion, I found that my hearing had faded away and I was in silence, and then I noticed that I was no longer feeling pain. Things seemed to be happening in slow motion, and I could see, for example, a girl in heels foot stepping on one of my hands, but no pain had registered. Eventually, I found myself no longer constrained by my body, and I slowly floated upwards, and I remember completely calmly thinking to myself that I was at last getting a great view of the gig. I could see myself on the floor, but this didn't worry me. I was calmer than I have ever been in my life. I will never be able to express the serenity I felt floating above myself. I found myself capable of the strangest things. Now that I was no longer constrained by being in a body, I was able to first spin and roll, and then, most incredibly, to just floor around the place. It was an amazing feeling. I had been in quite a bit of pain only minutes before, but this was not just the absence of pain. The absence of even a body had me feeling euphoric. Enjoying this new freedom from restriction, I floated upwards, and I honestly believe I was out of my body up near the ceiling of the hall, when I felt what can only be described as my body coalescing again, and I started to become aware of my first feeling, basically my head again, and the feeling of a sharp pain in it. I watched below as a guy leaned over my body, and he was pulling at the only part of me he could reach, the hair at the front of my head. At that moment, it was like everything stopped briefly, and I was given a clear choice. I'm not saying I heard the voice of God asking me whether I wanted to live or die. There was no voice, but I was clearly given the choice. I had been quite a depressed teen at the time, but I chose to return to life. I watched from above as the guy leaned over me, and I noted how cool his hand-painted scene on the back of his leather jacket was. I was quite impressed with the detail in it, and was still admiring it when I found myself dragged back into my body. I was now back on the ground with the guy pulling me up by my hair, trying to get an arm under me to drag me up. He took me up into his arms and carried me back to the seated area. He sat me down and was checking how bad I was when I started jabbering excitedly at him about how I'd had a near-death experience and an outer body experience. He thought I was out of my mind, which, incidentally, I wasn't. No drugs, no drop of alcohol had even been consumed. He started to take me more seriously when I was able to describe him in great detail. The painting on the back of his jacket, which there was no other way I could have seen. He was suitably shocked by the account of what had just happened to me. We sat together for a few minutes and he asked me what it was like. and I told him that it was the best thing I had ever experienced, and that I had come to a few conclusions. Namely, that there is nothing to fear in death, that all I could be sure about of death is that there is no pain there, and that it brings about an incredible peace. I was also somehow certain that, as I was completely convinced I had been given the choice to continue death or return to life, that there was something, some source, a consciousness that gave me that choice. I also became convinced that we are all equally insignificant and are just parts of consciousness. It took me a matter of weeks for the bruised and cuts I had suffered to pass, but it took a lot longer for the sense of peace it brought me to wear off. I will never fear death again, and I will never have any time for anyone who tells me of a violent, vengeful God which makes rules in which I should fear, because I've been there. I've felt it, and it is all love.